Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Your Excellency, Madam Vice President, and I must say it's very nice to see you sitting there as Madam Vice President. After the Revitalized RCS talks, Your Excellency Rebecca Nyandeng Demabior, Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, former Presidents, may I stand on existing protocols? And my South Sudanese sisters, it's good to be with you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Lema, for those very wise remarks referring to the peace process in Liberia. I want to refer to your own process, to the Revitalized RCS, and to the journey and to the kind of achievements that can be made when you have women coming from different parts of the political divide, united around one issue, that there must be participation of women in any revitalized government. And that is the reason why you have a female vice president being one of the vice presidents heading the clusters. That was part of that agreement. Is the reason why you have a female minister of defense and so many more women in government. It's also the reason why you have been able to take the agreement as a foundation, but not as a ceiling. And I hope that as you go forward, that will be the aspiration, to take the agreement as a foundation and not a ceiling. And referencing back to the agreement, and I think that I can speak to it with as much confidence and as much detail as Her Excellency the Vice President, because I was your mediator. And in that process, I can tell you that you had Madam Rebecca, you had Madam Aout, who has left us this afternoon, you had Madam Angelina, three strong women representing three different factions, but at the same time with a willingness to make sure that the agenda of women was firmly put on the table. And as Angelina said this morning, with a certain minimum agenda for women's participation. So how do we build on that? One of the first things I would like to remind you of is that building peace is not just about the Revitalized RCS. The Revitalized RCS is the foundation. It is your floor, it is not your ceiling. And that peace process must take place not just at the level of track 1 mediations, which is when you talk about the high-level mediations with senior political leaders. It must happen at track 2, it must happen at track 3, it must be a continuous basis, on a continuous basis, because peace is made at the community level. And if it is to be sustainable, it works from the bottom up. You cannot have it imposed from the ceiling. The other thing that I would like to say is that as you have now almost 2 years before you're heading towards elections, understand that that process of building peace continues even as you head towards elections. Elections are about a contestation for power. And wherever there's a contestation for power, there's the opportunity for conflict. And so if you don't have a mechanism that addresses those disputes that take place both at the community level, at the regional level, and at the national level, what will happen is that you'll be fighting fires everywhere. And I would like to encourage Madam Rebecca and all the female leaders here to think about how you're going to work with women in South Sudan over the course of the next few months to make sure that you have those peace-building structures at all levels of your national structure as well, so that when people are contesting for parliamentary elections, you know that if something comes up, there is a mechanism that you can use to begin to address disputes before they become conflicts across different communities. I'd also like to make the point that democracy is not an event, it's a process, and there's nothing like a perfect democracy. In this process of transition, what you have is how you are putting together the agreement in the transitional process to now consolidate your democracy. And I think that the women who have been part of this leadership journey should be also part of that process of structuring, again, what is your minimum agenda for women in that democratic process as you head towards elections? Are you going to be thinking about quotas? Are you going to think about minimum participation at all levels of governance? And how are you going to feed that into your efforts to make sure that you continue to consolidate your peace? Peace-building processes have been to a large extent dominated by men, but peace-building processes are equally spaces for women. What Lema just said reinforces that point. But you must understand that nobody gives you an entry on a silver platter, especially not in a situation and in a country where, and I think that I'm not saying anything that's new to you, where you have very strong patriarchal systems. And therefore, the thinking is that women come second and not first. I was very encouraged this morning to hear His Excellency the President say that the whole point about getting women involved in these processes is to make sure that you can play a stronger role in national life. That's exactly where we want to see the women of South Sudan. So I think that as you go about this process of building peace at the community level, dealing with some of the differences that you still have, you make sure that any structures that are developed are inclusive of women at the level of 35%. And let me tell you how we got to the 35%. So the demand at the point during the RCIS was for 50% women's representation. As you all know, the women of South Sudan had a meeting ahead of the negotiation process that was very civil society driven, and the demand was equality, and that you wanted to be very much an equal part of the revitalized RCIS government. But you also know that the gentlemen who were in that negotiation room were very tough characters. And for many of them, the idea of 50% was an anathema. And the idea of even 30% was too ambitious. But it comes back to having powerful women in different political groups who have a minimum consensus on what they want to achieve. Because at the time, and it's a pity Honorable Awut is not here, when we were having the discussion in between the break, she said, well, in the SPLM constitution, the provision is 35% participation of women. So maybe we can agree to that. And I asked her, are you going to say that? And she wasn't keen to be the one to say it. She rather wanted one of the gentlemen to say it instead, because that was more likely to get some buy-in. Honorable Angelina was very firm in her conviction that women should be adequately represented. So the argument was about how we get there, not if we get there. And Mama Rebecca was determined that South Sudan's women, young and old, were all going to have a seat at the table. But because the 35% was already in an existing document, it was difficult not to agree to that as a threshold. So even though we didn't get to the 50%, the fact that they had that knowledge, they knew what it was that could be possible, or that had even been agreed to before, it allowed for a situation where that was leveraged in order to create the opportunity that allows for the kind of participation that we're seeing right now. So use the existing agreements that you've arrived at before. Use your history, use your practice. You've been negotiating for decades, both when it came to your separation from Sudan, to the transitional period, to the beginning of the South Sudanese state, through the first RCIS, through the revitalized RCIS. You have had a whole lot of negotiations, agreements, references that can be leveraged for the purposes of being able to strengthen women's participation going forward. And I would encourage you to go back to those and to see how you can utilize them, especially as you go through this constitutional making process and you participate very effectively to make sure that those commitments in the revitalized RCIS find expression in the final constitution, and also find expression in the kind of numbers that South Sudanese women are able to have in parliament, not just competing for male seats in the 65%, but making sure that you have 35% of seats as female seats. And if you do that, I think that your future and the floor that would have been created for greater women's participation in politics and in leadership will lead to many more developments for this country. Women make up 60% of the population. You are already the majority. Women are at the forefront of making sure that social change happens. Look at the kind of ministerial portfolios that you hold. They are critical to the reconstruction of South Sudan. So now you have to leverage those and make sure that they find expression in the final outcome, so that going forward, you will be the example for the rest of this region. Because you would agree with me that with the exception of Kenya, there isn't any other country in this region that has developed those kind of quotas. And so we want to see you in this particular situation being the leaders and demonstrating to the rest of the region what is possible because of your commitment, because of your seriousness, and because I know that you are a bunch of very tough ladies, and I respect you for that. Thank you very much.